from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Camera's rolling.
Okay.
Ready to roll.
Mr. Guyot, thanks for doing this interview.
It's a pleasure.
Now, you were born and grew up in Pass Christian, Mississippi, and you said that racial prejudice, by and large, did not affect you during your youth. How could that be so in Mississippi at that age and time?
I come from the most non-Mississippi-like section of Mississippi. There was a heavy Catholic influence. Ingalls Shipyard was producing most of the major armaments for all hostilities in Pascagoula, hiring people from 63 counties. So you had the labor union influence, you had the Catholic Church influence, which was tremendous, and you had a population of 100,000 white people, 19,000 black people. The Catholic Church in 1957 or 58 made a decision that they were going to desegregate the schools. And they did it this way. The announcement was, we have two programs. We have excommunication and we have integration. Make your choice by Friday. Now, there was violence going on in Louisiana. Nothing happened on the Gulf Coast. So I learned firsthand that institutions can really have an impact on social policy. I was fortunate enough I bought 3 slot machines, Julian, because there was a lot of gambling on the Gulf Coast. Mm-hmm. And I just passed the academic test for entrance into Tougaloo College. And I was going to be sent to jail by Gaston Hughes. My father hires Bidwell Adams to represent me. Now, who is Bidwell? Bidwell Adams is the lieutenant governor under Bilbo. He's the chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. And he's a lawyer who represents black people who've been accused of raping white women. We go to his office, and my father says, here's the problem. And Bidwell said, don't worry about it. He calls up Gaston Hughes. He said, no, this boy's not black. He's a Creole. Now, I didn't correct him, Julian. Mm-hmm. And he then says, well, you know, this boy is going off to school. I don't want to hear any more about these slot machines. And Gaston said, well, I'm going to send him to Parchman. And Bidwell says, okay. And I looked at my father, we must be in the wrong place. But he continued, says, okay. He said, but if I hear any more about these slot machines, I'm going to call for a federal investigation of all gambling on the Gulf Coast. And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows that you caused it. At the time of this meeting, I was 17 years old. I'm now 71 years of age. I've never heard about those slot machines. And I've never heard about anyone who's heard about those slot machines, which drove home to me that all of the life that we live is political.
So let me back up a little bit. You're sitting in the office of Theodore Bilbo.
No, of Bidwell Adams.
Bidwell Adams. Okay.
Who was lieutenant governor when Bilbo was governor.
All right.
I was born in Harrison County. Mm-hmm. Bilbo was born in Hancock County. Mm-hmm. Bidwell Adams, after leaving the lieutenant governorship, then becomes a practicing lawyer and a loyal Kennedy Democrat. This was the guy who handled the patronage for the Democratic Party. I come out of a family. My grandfather's brother was chairman of the Republican Party in Hancock County for 65 years. He died at 105 years of age. His name is Louis Piernas, P-I-E-R-N-A-S. So he and I talked about Randolph, who my high school was named after. We talked about. He said, I saw the Civil War fought on the beaches of Bay St. Louis, not far from Waveland, where we used to go down to meet. And he talked about, my wife and I did a genealogy study, and we run across a WPA interview of him. Mm. And he says, well, you know, Bilbo is really terrible, and I just hope that blacks will be able to fight their way into the Democratic Party. And I got chills on my spine. Mm-hmm. I said, that's what I've been doing. So my family was very, very political. My grandfather was a man who taught me the value of listening. Mm. He would have, long before ecumenicalism was what it is today, he had a lot of Baptist ministers as friends. And they would meet outside every Sunday and they would decide what they're going to go in and convince him of. And I knew who was going to win this argument. So he would go in and they would come out convinced that they'd convinced my grandfather, and they were satisfied that he understood them and he agreed with them. And I knew that when I talked to him about afterwards that it had gone just the other way. But he had one habit, Julian. He said, if you went to him and said, Mr. Jules, I'm going fishing, he would repeat the word fishing. And I said, well, Grandpa, you're too smart to do that. I've seen the people you talk to, and he said, boy, it gives me a little bit more time to think about what I'm going to say. From that day on, Julian, I never questioned my grandfather. He and I read the newspaper together every day. And we also listened to two people on radio. Whenever the FDR spoke, he gathered the family to listen to our president. And another guy was Ronald Reagan.
Really? Why Reagan?
Why Reagan? Because we liked his style. We didn't like his ideology, but we were impressed with how he did it. I mean, he could paint the pictures. And so he takes me, I'm 7 years old, he takes me in front of the Catholic Church in Mississippi, and in St. Philomena's, and I read Paul's letters to the Galatians and Ephesians, and I'm just proud. I'm with my grandfather. I can read before my congregation. I can do anything.
Right.
So I learned from my family the value of service and the interrelationship between religion and politics. My father was a man who would have made Lyndon Johnson look like a piker.
Oh, really?
If he could have just gotten the kind of political opportunities that I had. My father got in a contest one time about a mathematics problem. Everyone in the town told him that he was wrong, that he had figured it out wrong. And they sent back to the book manufacturers, and the book manufacturers said, we made a mistake. He's right. He's a man who, when he goes into a jury, a woman wanted to get $6,000 from an insurance company. And everybody in the jury said, oh, that's. Then my father said, well, send out and get a lot of coffee. Because until she gets $6,000, we're not going to decide anything. I saw my father, Julian, beat one of the richest men in Paris Christian almost to a pulp.
Really? In
front of the post office with his fist, and then take me by the hand and walk me home. I come from a city that was, the Catholic Church had desegregated. I could use any restaurant I want. I could go into any drugstore I want. I could ride on the bus anytime, anywhere. I was a longshoreman at 13. I used the white restroom on the Gulf Coast. Only Dr. Felix Dunn, who was a black, wealthy political person, and myself did that. Now, I did it not because it had anything to do with nonviolence. I did it because my father would have killed any 20 people that had anything to say to me.
But didn't you know that there was a great difference between where you lived in Mississippi and the rest of Mississippi? And how did you balance in your mind the fact that you're able to do these things here, but just a few miles away, you would take your life in your hands to do them?
You see, what really brought this home to me was I went to Tougaloo College. Tougaloo College was threatened with extinction by the state legislature. It had an interracial faculty. It was perfectly designed for me. I needed to be someplace that was academically free, that would be committed to social change, and that would be committed to empowerment and the development of leadership. Tougaloo was all of that. And when I get there, I meet Ed King, I meet David Broder, I meet Ernest Berinsky. Ernest Berinsky is a Jew driven out of Germany. He comes to Tougaloo, he becomes an institution there, and he develops a theory that some institutions are functional only by their absence of function. That's the Democratic Party in Mississippi. It only needs to be organized every 4 years. They go to a convention, they come back, and then it disbands. Because if they don't disband, then they have to answer people's problems. But you can run the state apparatus without doing that. I meet A.A. Branch. A.A. Branch is a member of the leadership of the YMCA. A.A. Branch says to us, the policy of Tougaloo is you can become involved in any demonstration you want around voting. We're going to assist you in doing that. But take your books with you. We're going to test you just like everyone else. Only Tougaloo College and Miles College did that. No other college in the South or in America did that, to my knowledge. So I'm in the perfect place for me. I meet people who are committed to nonviolence. I meet people I meet John Salter, who teaches me everything I need to know about socialism. I meet people who are committed to. A.A. Branch is a leader of the YWCA, but it's A.A. Branch who walks into the COFO office in 1964 with the papers to join with the United Church of Christ and the National Council of Churches in taking over the WLBT television station.
Tell me the names, before we jump this far ahead, tell me the names of some of the students you went to school with whom we know as movement people.
I went to school with Dory Ladner.
And Joyce.
Joyce Ladner. Quite a few people. Franklin, Johnny Frazier,
okay,
who was one of the leaders. He wasn't a student there, but he was. I worked in conjunction with him. Quite a few people.
Now,
the Anderson, who later becomes a member of the state Supreme Court.
I know this is counterfactual, but what if you had gone to Jackson State instead of Tougaloo? How would Lawrence Guyot have turned out, do you think?
I don't think I would have lasted at at Jackson State. Because I believe I'd come up in a town that created a certain political expectations of what was expected of me by my family and by my church. So I wouldn't have fit into the conformity, the strict, rigid conformity and hierarchical leadership of Jackson State. Dory Ladner and Joyce Ladner went there first, and they had to leave there and come to Tougaloo. Tougaloo was an oasis in the state of Mississippi. It was committed to academic freedom, committed to growth, to leadership, and its very existence was threatened by the state legislature, but they continued to move ahead.
Again, let me back up a little bit. I was just thinking about Pass Christian and the neighborhood, the community you grew up in, the Catholic Church's influence, the influence of labor unions. Most of Mississippi doesn't have this. Most of the South doesn't have this.
That's right.
It's only when you get into Louisiana that there's any real Catholic presence. And outside of your section of Mississippi, probably not much anyplace else. And the same would be true of Alabama, Georgia, and so on. You ever consider how lucky you were to have run into the Catholic Church and to live in a community where labor unions flourished?
Let me add one other thing to it, and I'll respond to your question. You also had Keesler Air Force Base, which was a major dynamo. But yes, I consider myself very fortunate. I was born in the right town. I get to go to the right church. I get to go to the right college, and then I run into SNCC.
Yeah.
So, I come from a family that understands that in 1964, my uncle, my favorite uncle, says to me, "The mayor wants to meet with you about the summer project." And I walk up the steps to his house. He said, "But I don't want you to call him from my house." My uncle's scared about being tired of this. But I go down and talk to the mayor, and we talk. I said, "Here's what we're going to do." And they say, "Here's what we're going to do." And that's it. I give no quarter, they give no quarter. And then, this is 64. In 66, that same uncle runs for alderman in Pasquistan. So you get an idea of the impact of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
A moment ago, you said you ran into SNCC. Tell me about running into SNCC. How did that happen? And who embodied SNCC for you?
Dory Ladner, Joyce Ladner, and Bob Moses. I meet Bob Moses, John Doerr, and Marion Barry all at the same time. They've come out of Macomb. We're all working at 714 Rose Street. There we have Moses, the Ladners, Bevel, Diane, quite a few other folks, but LaVon Brown, Sheila Michaels.
Yeah.
This is the Freedom House, right? From there, we move into the Delta. We go to Amsey Moore's house. Amsey Moore parcels it out to Joe McDonald, Miss Sissons, and we run across a lady named Fannie Lou Hamer. Belleville, myself, McLaurin, and Foreman go to a mass meeting. we open the call for anyone who wants to go down and register. Fannie Lou Hamer raises her hand. And we run across a woman who is a religious fundamentalist, who knows the Bible, a woman who has a perfect sense of timing in her speech pattern. She can weave together 3 different issues and collapse them in 25 words and bring it all together. She's a woman who walks into churches and who takes over. If the minister is a good minister, she treats him as a good minister. Mm-hmm. If he is wavering, she preaches to him before his congregation. Yeah. And nobody says a word to her. So here we get the perfect melding of religious fundamentalism and pragmatic politics. Because not only does she go to register to vote, but as you know, she becomes a national celebrity. Mm-hmm. She becomes a woman who Andy Young takes to meet with Senator Church when he wants to talk about Vietnam. She's one of the founders of the National Women's Political Caucus. She's the woman who speaks at the 64 Democratic Convention, and Lyndon Johnson calls a press conference to interrupt her. But at that time, there was only ABC, NBC, and CBS, and they all play her speech in its entirety that evening. And then there are 1,200 telegrams saying to seat the Freedom Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And then Lyndon has to apply pressure because Lyndon says, and he says it in his tapes. The good thing about Lyndon is we got tapes on him. Mm-hmm. Lyndon says, look, we can't have a floor fight on this. We can't have a floor fight to seat an all-white delegation and then go and ask black people to vote for us in November. So the floor fight must be stopped. And then as President of the United States, he pulled out all of the stops. Mm. Delegates from California were told, one of them was told, your husband can be a federal judge. All you got to do is stop voting for the Freedom Democratic Party. Candidates in New York were told, y'all have a lot of OEO money, as you know, the Office of Economic. Yeah. And you can keep it as long as you stop supporting the Freedom. They went to the delegates in California, and unfortunately, the California Democratic Party had passed the delegation supporting their position. But the president put all of his pressure on all of them. So, and as you know, we couldn't get the floor fight. And not being able to get the floor fight, we were then offered a compromise of 2 people, I'm proud of the fact that I'm the chairman of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I'm in jail in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I couldn't have given a speech as good as Fannie Lou Hamer did. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't have led the Freedom Democratic Party into making what I consider the most courageous, pragmatic political decision in American politics. They said to this compromise, no. Now, and it's interesting, some historians, as you know, Bayard Rustin comes out late after that with an article called The Difference Between Politics and Protest in Commentary Magazine. But what I am so proud of is no delegation went to the 64 Democratic Convention who understood the relationship between dying and the right to vote. Mm. Every one of these people had lost money, had served time in jail, had their names posted in the newspaper when they registered to vote. They understood, but they were willing to take on the strongest political organization in the state of Mississippi, the Democratic Party. And they were willing to go into Lyndon Johnson's convention and fight in it as though it was their convention.
Let me back you up one more time.
Okay.
You're going to Tougaloo and you're majoring in biology and minoring in philosophy. Why'd you choose these fields? What was your career plan then?
My career plan then was to become a doctor. Mm. And then I ran into chemistry, and I changed my career plan. I just couldn't. Now, when I tested while in Tougaloo, I scored off the charts on everything except mathematics and chemistry. Well, there was no way I was going to be a doctor having those. So I made a shift.
And what did you decide? What would you have been?
If I'd have had my druthers, I'd have been a lawyer.
Okay. And why didn't you go that way?
Why did I go that way? Because I understood the universality of both of politics and how much the judiciary had framed that. Mm-hmm. I understood that the Brown case. I understood that the Baker versus Carr now opened up the political arena to the courts, which meant that there would be more power, and history proves me right on that. We have reached a point in this country where we have an excellent power and scope of the judiciary, and now we've got to fight to keep it.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago about running into Bob Moses and the Ladner sisters and so on, and finding this community of people who make up the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. What did you think of them? What was your impression of them, and how, in your mind, did they differ from the run-of-the-mill college students and others you were associated with?
I thought that these were people who had a religious commitment to interracialism, that they were fundamentally about change, that they were different from the other organizers I'd been exposed to, and that they were not about creating membership. They were about creating empowerment. And I find that is what fascinated me. Because here were people who were very well educated, who could think on their feet, who were interdependent, and who had fierce respect for one another. I mean, and then once I saw how they operated, then I was totally captivated. Their position was that they were going to work with established leaders who were there. E.W. Steptoe, later Hartman Turnbow, the people. They go into Macomb. I don't go into Macomb. And SNCC is almost shot out of Macomb. But what it discovers is that the black community will protect and support them. It will hide them. It will feed them. It will clothe them. It will lie for them. It will do anything to protect them. And this carries us into the Delta. And there we go into Greenwood. And we find that in Greenwood, Mississippi, there was tremendous fear. But we worked. Moses proposed, let's have some demonstrations. And I said, no, they don't know us yet. So we got better known, moving around. And then when we had demonstrations, we had 100 people come into the jail to bring us food and support. That's not supposed to happen. I mean, what is the one thing black people learn? Don't go to jail. Don't be associated with those who go to jail. If you're their friends, wait until they get out of jail to be friends. So we push Greenwood to the point where we're having 500 people come down to register to vote. Hardy Lott, a segregationist lawyer who defends Byron D. LeBeckwith, says to me in the LaFleur County Courthouse one day, Guyot, you should be very proud of how many people y'all got coming down in LaFleur County. I said, well, Mr. Lott, I understand. We got them coming down and y'all are turning them away from registration. What we need to do is create a situation where they can come down and get registered. He said, well, that's going to be a good fight. And it proved to be a good fight, because what we were able to do in Greenwood is force the Department of Justice. Once the voter registration workers got arrested there, John Doerr says, okay, we're going into court. But instead of filing a type A suit, he files a type B suit, which just gets us out. But what we found was that the Department of Justice, to this day, defends their position by saying, we didn't want to occupy LaFleur County. Because remember, while this was going on, there was also the case of Ole Miss, and there was the case of Theron Lynn. And so we were able to, I think one of the major achievements of SNCC was to bring about a working relationship with the Department of Justice. We trained them. We took John Doerr to Walthall County, and we introduced John Doerr to a man named John Hardy. John Hardy was a SNCC activist who brought some people in to register to vote. Mr. Woods, the registrar, hit him with a gun and a stick, and the Department of Justice said, wait a minute, we're going to stop this prosecution. We're going to, and the reason we're stopping is when you hit him, you hit every black man a woman who might want to come to register to vote. So they develop a theory called an injunction pending appeal. And that's what they do. They say, you can't prosecute this man. And they take it to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit said, that's right.
But couldn't we say that one of the reasons that happened is because of somebody like John Doerr, not because of the department itself, but because somebody like John Doerr stood out among his fellows and pushed hard for these kind of remedies?
There's an absolute. John Doerr was not the ordinary Department of Justice. John Doerr believed in going into the field, finding out where the danger was, and regardless, they trained his staff to do that. And so there's no question. John Doerr participates not only in that, but John Doerr also, when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party files the first private lawsuit under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, John Doerr and the Department of Justice files an amicus. We go to the Supreme Court, we win it 8-1. And what does that case say? That case says, right now the law says that the Attorney General is the only one who can institute suits. But we're going to take the position that from this day forward, anyone who is aggrieved by Section 5 has the right to bring a lawsuit under Section 5. Do you see the range that they're giving us? They broaden Section 5. They give us the best possible interpretation we can. Now, this case is my idea. I read a book called Gideon's Trumpet by Anthony Lewis. And it describes Lyndon Johnson as someone who stole his election. And I knew, I'd been trained well enough to know that if you had the choice between trained by being given guidance by a thief or by a bishop, choose the thief. The bishop will tell you, no, this is not right. The thief will tell you, this is how I did it, and this is how I've stopped other people from doing it. I knew that Lyndon Johnson didn't want anyone to ever be able to do what he had done. And I go and I find Section 5, and it said, it's the most beautiful language ever written. It says that any change by a covered political subdivision that has the possibility of diluting the Voting Rights Act must either be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or litigated before a 3-judge panel only in the District of Columbia. Most beautiful words I've ever heard. So what we do, once we win that case before the Supreme Court, all lawyers in the South switch from the 15th Amendment to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Now, the work you're doing with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and these colleagues that you mentioned earlier doesn't come without a cost. And you were beaten a couple of times. I don't know if it's painful for you now to talk about that.
No, it's factual.
Tell us about these two things, at least 2 cases where you were beaten.
Okay, one of them was in Winona. Fannie Lou Hamer, Anel Ponda,
June
James
Johnson.
West, June Johnson are returning from a South Carolina meeting. They stop in Winona, they are arrested. I call and I said, do you have these people? He said, well, come on over and find out. And I go over and I know they're there. And they beat me almost to death. And they want me to sign a statement saying I drove over there and fell out of a car and hurt myself. I said, I'm not going to sign that. I'd never driven a car in my life, and I certainly wasn't going to sign it.
Let's pause for a moment, just so you can get some water or 1 second. Okay.
I leave Greenwood and I go into Winona, and I'm beaten. They threaten to burn my testicles with wooden sticks. I know that I have to stay conscious, otherwise they're going to kill me. I'm beaten by 12 people. Then I'm asked to sign a statement, which I refused to sign. Then they charged me with murder.
Who had you killed?
I hadn't killed anyone.
Who did they say you killed?
I had a note from someone who had said to me, who had given in the street, someone had been killed, and they took that and said, well, you killed him. And what I found was that I knew that I wasn't going to get out of Winona alive. And I didn't think any of us that were there. The only thing, they left my cell door open. They left a knife outside. They sent someone who showed me a fake badge saying I'm an FBI agent. Now tell me what really happened. And Medgar Evers was killed while we were in Winona, which then, because they turned off the radio, I knew something had happened, tragic had happened, I just didn't know who. And then Andy Young, Bevel, and Frank Smith come to get me out of jail. And then we eventually go to the Medgar Evers funeral, and then I leave there and go to Hattiesburg. But it was clear to me that we were beaten too badly. I mean, we were beaten almost beyond recognition. And they were not going to allow us to go back and have pictures taken. As fortunate as it is, I believe that there are two things that saved our lives. One, Roberta Gala and other people from across the country start calling in to ask to speak to us. The other, that let them know that other people know they're. And number two, the assassination of Medgar Evers. I just don't think. The other time that I'd been beaten quite a few other times, but one time that I remember vividly that I wasn't beaten, but I think it's something I want to talk about now.
Okay.
We were driving in a car from Hattiesburg to Jackson, and it was a car couldn't go over 50 miles an hour, had bad tires, and some people with shotguns were behind us, and I said, "Stop the car." And I got out, I walked back, and I looked at the piece, I said, "Look, the FBI isn't following us. If you want to go to jail for 10 years, just do anything to anybody in that car." And them good old boys turned around, and then we got back in the car. Yes, Julian, I lied, but I'd rather lie and take control of my life than to leave it to someone else who I didn't think had my good being intentions.
Now, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's the district's representative to the Congress, has known you since the early 1960s. In fact, did she come with you to get the people out of jail in Winona?
She was involved.
She was a young lawyer then.
She was a lawyer, yes, she was involved.
She said you walk right into terror. What does she mean by that?
Well, she said that at a dinner that was given in my name here in Washington. And the way she laid it out was this. She said, "Look, all black Southern men were taught, stay out of jail. If your friends are in jail, send them money, pray for them, but don't go visit them." And here was a man who knew that there were civil rights workers arrested, and he went right into jail knowing what the terror was. And he looked at terror and walked right into it. I felt very complimented about that.
Now, can you tell us quickly what differences were between the NAACP, long-established organization, active across the state of Mississippi, SCLC, relatively new organization? How do these organizations differ in the ways they operated in Mississippi with SNCC? NAACP, SCLC, SNCC.
The NAACP took the position, and I'm quoting Roy Wilkins, who said this, part of this on the great documentary, Eyes on the Prize. Mississippi is a bestial state. It should be cut off and allowed to be drift into the sea. Anyone who, he didn't say this on camera, but he said it later, anyone who attempts to organize is crazy. We're going to raise money out of the atrocities of Mississippi and move forward. We're going to litigate there when possible, and that's it. SCLC is a tougher problem to answer because everything that was done that shows how creative, how pluralistic, how indigenous, and how really sophisticated the politics of SNCC in Mississippi was backed by Martin Luther King. So we got to separate Martin Luther King from SCLC. Martin Luther King supported us in the freedom election, in which we got 80,000 voters. He supported us in the summer project, which we were able to really create the Freedom Democratic Party, create the Freedom Schools, create the Wednesday Group by Dorothy Height. The Wednesday Group was bringing in black and white women from across the country. They meet with people who are in the movement and then go back and talk to their ministers, their bishops, their newspaper, and their senators and their congressmen. We also create the Freedom Schools, which are to this day carried out by the Children's Defense Fund. And
now, why is there this difference, this dichotomy between Martin Luther King, the head of SCLC and SCLC? Why is he behaving in one way and the organization he heads behaving in another way?
Well, I'll tell you why. I think what he appreciated was the freedom and the creativity of what was going on in Mississippi. Here we were we were sending a message to the country that if you allow us to vote in Mississippi unimpeded, we will do it. 80,000 people backed that up. We said about the 64 Summer Project, we can't bring Mississippi to America, but we can bring America to Mississippi. Because we found out we could not protect ourselves, we were going to be picked off one by one. We were organizing against the entire state apparatus of Mississippi and the country. The country was totally indifferent to voting. We had to nationalize this problem. We then challenged the Democratic Party in Atlantic City. We're supported in all of these endeavors by Martin Luther King. He supports us in the congressional challenge. And then I asked him to do something harder than everything else he's ever done. I said, look, Martin, we know that the Voting Rights Act is going to pass. We need you to sign a memorandum, along with myself, John Lewis, and other people, saying that we realize the Voting Rights Act is going to pass, but the congressional delegation from Mississippi still should be unseated. He does it. When he does that, they said, first of all, y'all forged his name. He sticks with us. And then what happens then, Julian, is, and this is David Garrow in his book. As you know, David Garrow is the chronicle of Martin, makes the point that the Freedom Democratic Party in this memorandum had a larger impact on the Voting Rights Act than did Selma. David Garrow says it. Now, because what happened, and this all happened because of a guy named Michael Thelwell. Michael Thelwell gets a chance to attend the leadership conference meetings. And when you read the first proposal for the Voting Rights Act, it's as weak as can be. You would need 20 complaints, and the president may authorize. We needed a greater trigger mechanism, and Section 5 was that trigger mechanism. But Section 5 wouldn't have been created unless we brought the congressional challenge. We got 149 congressmen to say yes, the congressional delegation from Mississippi should be seated. At the same time, the United States Supreme Court was hearing a case called United States versus Mississippi, filed in 1962, argued in 1965 that it would have declared all of the laws in Mississippi unconstitutional. Imagine, if you will, if the Department of Justice had asked for emergency relief. That would have meant new elections for everything in Mississippi. They didn't, because, of course, Lyndon didn't want to fight with us in 64 and then give us the gift of political empowerment in 65. So what I'm saying, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leads to one of the most brilliant, encumbering, people involving empowerment process of attack on any oppressed state. And there was no state more oppressive than Mississippi. Lyndon Johnson said it best. There's America, there's the South, and then there's Mississippi.
You know, I've said, and I've had people object to me saying that you and I and others like us belong to the last generation of African Americans who have engaged in sustained mobilization in the 20th century. You and I are members of the last generation that have done that. Nothing has happened since we were of college age. You haven't seen any repetition of this. Why is that so?
Well, I tell you
why are we unique?
I tell you why. We're not really unique. I appreciate the laudatory way in which you handle it,
Thanks. I'd like to praise us.
No, I want to say very clearly, we are entitled to praise because we are a group of people who changed the world.
Of course.
And it is very important that we understand it. But when we look at Operation Understanding, when we look at cultural leadership, we look at the Children's Defense Fund, I think the best training of what we did is now being done by those three groups. And the Young People's Project, headed by Moses' children.
Right.
They are doing the kind of organizing we did. And what we must do is use the mantra of pull power right here. See, we got the literature. We got the mantra, we got the history, What we have an opportunity to do, and is very necessary for us to do, is meld our experience. See, because what distinguishes us from a lot of other people, we saw total oppression, and we brought about change. Every impediment to us, we turned it around. We turned it to, you can't register to vote, we're going to register to vote. You won't allow us to vote, we're going to vote anyway. You can't organize politically. We were not going to allow you to. We're going to put your name in the newspaper when we get, Julian, thousands of people who have everything to risk, and they are willing to risk their lives and their children's lives and everything they have, and you can't do it secretly. That's success. That's called real political mobilization. Now, I think from January 23rd to 26th, the people who created this, the veterans of the Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi, will be meeting. And on yesterday, I read in the Washington Post about the civil rights activists going online, the Color Purple and the NAACP. See, my concern is, how do we get those people to come down? See, because as far as I'm concerned, the greatest organizers in America come out of Mississippi and SNCC. Who do you compare us to?
No one. There's no comparison.
None.
And there's no mobilization of the sort we engaged in the 1960s today. And I'm always asking, why is this so? Why is it
let me answer
such
your
a
question this
failure
way.
of our community to mobilize in the way we did when we were young people and a little more vigorous than we are now?
Let me give you what is the most logical and most practical answer. We're now given the perfect solution, the perfect opportunity that brings us back to that period. If we allow the Republicans to have control of the House and the Senate, except for the next 2 years, well, they don't control the Senate, but then we must forever write off that whole beautiful mantra that we created before then. Because it's very clear. I'm astounded that the political commentators look at a sense of equivalence between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. There's none. The Republican Party is by definition obstructionist and wants to narrow the scope and function of government. The Democratic Party wants to do just the converse. So we now have a golden opportunity to fight for what we have, because it's all on the table. Everything you can imagine, given the Republicans' need to destroy America as we know it. But we can prevent them. You see, 1 million of us who voted in 2008 didn't vote in the midterm elections. And what we've got to do now is use all of our resources. And I'm for the next 2 years, I'm going to do nothing but push books, the mantra of SNCC, the example of SNCC as an organizing vehicle and I'm going to call on everyone who participated in the freedom elections, in the freedom rides, in the summer project, you name them. It's time for action now. You see, and the reason I can do that with confidence is there's a difference between people who have made change, and there's a difference to people who have written about change. We are those who made change, and we now simply have to bring in young people to help us do it again.
But
see,
we seem to have trouble attracting in sufficient numbers young people today. I know you mentioned the Moses children who are doing wonderful work, and other groups are doing wonderful work, but there's no equivalent today of the actions we engaged in the 1960s. No equivalent anywhere in the country that I can see.
Well, let me say to you, my dear friend, if there was ever a time to get into motion to bring that about, it is now. We got 2 years.
Absolutely, and if we don't act now, it's all lost.
Not only will it be lost, but it will be irretrievable. It's not a question of waiting 10 years and there'll be another flip.
No, it won't happen. Well, let's not deal with these dim thoughts. But I want you to give the people who will see this some picture of how you occupied yourself, say in the summer of 1964. What would a typical week be for you, if there is such a thing as a typical week in Mississippi in 1964? How would you occupy yourself? What would you do all day?
I would stay in contact with people who were organizing. I was
Where would you be located in the summer of '64?
I would be in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, or in Jackson,
Okay.
or in Greenwood.
Okay, because the SNCC headquarters was in Greenwood for the
That's
summer.
right. That's right. And I was one of the first to go into Greenwood. And my job was to stay abreast of the political, where did communities need help? What kind of support did they need? How could we assist them in empowering people? Because our position was SNCC people were capable of, one or two SNCC people would go into a town, get it organized in 2 weeks, find a place to stay, all on a salary of $10 a week when it was available. And we wanted to facilitate that as much as possible. We had to stay in touch with the political news, what was happening on the other side, how do we respond to it, what kind of press releases there, and then we'd call you and Mary King and others for when we needed help. But it meant setting up meetings, carrying out meetings, improving the skills of the leadership that was there. Harry Bowie and I traveled the state of Mississippi. Bowie was a black Episcopalian, one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. He worked for the Delta Ministry. Well, the Delta Ministry was organized because I invited all religious groups to come to Hattiesburg in '63. We then, when SNCC leaves Mississippi in '66, they are replaced by the Delta Ministry. Because the new ally for the Freedom Democratic Party is the Delta Ministry. And they support the Children's Defense Fund. The Children's Defense Fund, headed by Edelman, hires 3,000 people in Mississippi. So that instantly becomes a negative attraction to Senator Stennis. And he must be killed, so there's an attempt to destroy it. But it is the ability of SNCC to continue to bring in forces to be used in its political methodology. We bring in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. And I'm proud of the fact that they were to the left, and we got castigated for that. You know, they're comment. And I remember when Dave Dennis, Bob Moses, myself met with Kunstler, Kanoy, and others. And we asked them, I said, do y'all agree that we will make the decisions and y'all do the litigating? They said yes. And they never deviated from that. Now, I'm very proud that SNCC took the position that we were not going to let anyone tell us what to do. I remember after Kennedy was killed, there was a request by Lyndon Johnson to be a moratorium on demonstrations. And Theodore White had written a book saying that SNCC were really communists and really dangerous people. And we analyzed that. We had a conference at Howard University. And Bayard Rustin spoke there, Baldwin spoke there, and the great socialist Norman Thomas spoke there. And Norman Thomas told us, look, we can't win by singing, but we can't win unless we sing. And he said, you must understand, every program that we came up with, the Democrats litigated. I mean, turned into laws.
Right.
So he was encouraging. The question was, would we be part of the nullification? And we said no. We're going ahead with the Summer Project. Now, the Summer Project was not universally accepted. Myself and Fannie Lou Hamer were two of the few people that supported the original. But once Bob Moses comes back from Macomb, when one of the witnesses was killed that evening, that witnessed the Herbert Lee killing, he then throws his weight behind.
Yeah, Lewis Allen.
Lewis Allen. He then throws his weight behind the Summer Project, and it happens. I think the Summer Project was one of the most creative, indigenous, empowering, nationalizing activities, and it couldn't have been pulled off by anyone but SNCC. Because SNCC was not answerable to anyone who could tell it anything. When we pulled off the freedom election, the voter education project said we can no longer fund y'all.
And when you were doing this activity with SNCC, how much were you paid?
$10 a week.
And this is before you were married?
That's right.
Did you get married while you worked for SNCC?
Yes.
Did your salary go up?
No.
Mine did. But
Good. I'm glad you did.
I had children. Now, you mentioned earlier on, and I'm amazed at your recall, 714 Rose Street, which is the address of the Freedom House in Jackson.
Right.
What would life be like?
Life would be like
House?
this. There would be people. Bevel was there. Diane was there. Thomas Gaither was there. Paul Brooks was there. Dory Ladner was there. Joyce Ladner was there. Moses was there. I was there. LaVon Brown was there. And what it served as is a reconciliation post for everyone arrested in the Freedom Rides. Because when you got arrested in the Freedom Rides, you were tried in Jackson. And when you came to Jackson, you came to 714 Rose Street. And then we acquainted you with what was going on in the state and how you could be helpful when you went back to wherever you were. So it was this cross-fertilization of activism that was uninhibited, that was indigenous, that was empowering, and that was answerable to no one. So, but we were able to creatively involve all of the National Council of Churches gets committed once they come to Hattiesburg. They create the Delta Ministry, which lasts for 25 years. They also join us when we challenge the congressional delegation. Breeden, Fitzsimmons, these are people from the National Council of Churches. They come to us and they talk to Michael Thelwell, and I said, what can we do about the congressional challenge? They said, what you can do is open doors. Where we don't have a civil rights movement, we have churches, and you can talk to James Farmer of CORE and myself got to talk to Mr. Ford, who later becomes President Ford, because his bishop called him and said, you got to talk to him. So what we found is that the labor unions, remember, at the Howard University meeting, the FFL-CIO said to us, we're going to give you a contribution of $25,000, and we're going to set up a board of directors to tell you what to do. That lasted, you can imagine how long that lasted. But then if we look at when the summer project was agreed to, some people said to us, well, you know, William Sloan Coffin has to head this. It never happened, Julian. And then you remember the great meeting of a meeting in New York about after the Democratic Convention. You got Gloucester Current, you got Roy Wilkins, you got Cortland Cox, you got James Farmer, and they said, look, Mississippi is now becoming a national and international paradigm. We can't allow the people that's running it down there to run it. The underbrush.
Ignorant people like Fannie Lou Hamer.
Like Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes.
And the underbrush like E.W. Steptoe.
Incredible.
And Cortland said, don't you think you should talk to the people in Mississippi about this? They said, no. See, what we found was that we were creating something in Mississippi. And when you beat the best, and when you can organize around the worst, then you create a political example of what can be. Curtis Gaines, who is one of the top demographicers of the vote every year, wrote a letter in 1965. He said, I've toured the South, and if this SNCC MFDP kind of operation is allowed to happen in the South, it will not be loyal to the National Democratic Party. This letter is written in its entirety in Local People by John Dittmer. I got it and I gave it to Dittmer and he put it in the book. He said, what we must do is quickly pass the Voting Rights Act so we can then bring blacks into the Democratic Party. So I just wanted to say that to say, look at how many other forces we were resonating with, and they put their own interpretation on it. The NEA and the AFT both send representatives to the Summer Project to capture the Freedom Curriculum. We meet in Hartford, Connecticut, years later, And there's someone there who stands up and says, we had a discussion about the curriculum for the Freedom Schools last week. So there's this tremendous infusion of bringing the political process to the average citizen.
Now, after 64, did you leave Mississippi? When did you move to D.C.?
I moved to D.C. in 1968.
68.
I was a delegate to the Democratic Convention in 68. We organized, Harry Bowie and I organized, what happened was this. The Loyalists thought that they would become part of the regular Democratic Party. Bidwell Adams, my dear friend, was chairing the state convention. And he said, look, if you don't desegregate this delegation, you're wasting your bus fare to Chicago. And we waited for that to happen. And Aaron Henry and the Loyalists, who were set up as an alternative to destroy MFDP, they were unsuccessful. So then I said to them, let's join together. The Loyalists hooked up with the MFDP. We got 50% of the delegation. They got 50%, and we were seated in 68. Now, and they said to us, Harry Bowie and myself met with Charles Evers and Harding Carter, and they looked at the names and said, how did y'all do it? I said, well, look, y'all had the money. Y'all had the prestige. But we knew all of these people years before they knew you. So we went up and set up the nominee, and we got Miss Rucker. We got our people.
Yeah. So when you came up here, you began to focus on D.C. issues. Tell us a little bit about that.
I had a good time up here.
Yeah.
I began to fight for same-sex marriage. I began to fight for having the first presidential primary in Washington so we could point out to the country the fact that we don't have congressional or senatorial representation. We get the first primary, but quite a few of the Democrats don't participate in it. Then I publicly lambaste them for that. I fight to do away with term limits. I believe that we fought too much, we've bled, too many of us have died to allow the calendar to determine the political situation. We do away with term limits here. I find this is a very creative city council, and it is one that I can operate conveniently with. I become an ANC commissioner. I begin delving in economic development. I'm involved in everything that was developed in Columbia Heights. Every one of those 37 proposals was brought to us. We were told to pick a developer to analyze and to grade them. We did that. So I built some of the political infrastructure of the state, of the city, and I am very much of an activist. I supported Fenty for mayor. I supported the write-in because I remember in 1968, and you remember, I'm sure, yourself, when we made a decision to move from the civil rights movement to carry the church with us into the political arena. And we forswore hate. We said, we're not going to hate people, and we're going to choose the ballot instead. The Bible and the ballot infusion.
Yeah.
And then I see a campaign that to me was the real implementation of more hate than I've ever seen in my life. Fenty was not only defeated, he was turned into a hate caricature. And because of that, I joined him in the write-in. And it's one of all the things I've done politically, I'm just as proud of that. Because one of the things I understand very, very clearly, if black people ever make the mistake of separating our politics from our religion, we're damn nigh finished.
But at the same time, you mentioned same-sex marriage, and same-sex marriage is just an anathema in many black homes and in the black church community. One of the biggest opponents is Walter Fauntleroy, Reverend Walter Fauntleroy, who's Dr. King's lieutenant here. So how do you manage in your practice of Christianity to balance this support for something that many black Christians just think is terrible?
Well, I think one of the best movements in that position was my wife. My wife and I met when I went to California she was raising money for SNCC, She comes to Mississippi. We leave there. We get married in Washington in '67. She supports me in everything I've done. She gets a job to help pay my way through Rutgers Law School. She's with me. She goes to jail with me in Mississippi. We live together in Mississippi. My wife is white. And whenever I've gone to the hospital, she's come with me. Quite a few times she saved my life. And I said to myself, can I really accept all of this and deny it to two other people of the same sex who are in love with one another? And I couldn't. And I may shock and amaze you when I say this, but all of my politics has been based on my religious beliefs. And I tell people, I said, look, when you said, when you're told religiously to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those who are bound, it doesn't tell you to find out what the charges are. But whenever you attempt to do any of those three, you enter into the political arena. And that's all right, because there's no other way to do it. Because I teach political empowerment, and the first question I ask my class is, let's talk about something that's not political. Once we got through that, then we go on to the question of what are you doing to enhance your political mobility and motility and options?
But you know, I was thinking as you were talking there about the years we've known each other, and I frankly have not thought about you as a religious person.
I understand.
Probably I don't know that side of you at all well.
Well, that's understandable, and I'm not offended by that at all, because I know you, and I'm very happy with our relationship. I remember when you would share your poems with me early in SNCC, and we both love books, and we both are very proud of what we've done. But I learned that we must be able to ethically transcend ourselves and put ourselves in other fellows' shoes and then make a judgment. I have no problems with... I testified before the city council, and I said, look, I'm astounded by people wanting to vote on denying other people human rights. I said, we didn't sacrifice lives for that. The vote should be used to build, to strengthen. It should be used affirmatively. And quite a few people agreed with me on that. See, I think the beauty of politics, even though it has a bad name right now, will be revived. Because in order to save this country, we're going to have to revive it. And I think I look at it as a good journey, because as long as you have a country in which 6 out of 10 people don't know the difference between the various layers of government, how can you really create public opinion about affirmative and moving? Jefferson said it very clearly. He said, look, in order to have a Republican style of government, you got to have an informed electorate. My dear friend, we have a tragically misinformed directorate right now.
What would you...
Hold on one
Okay.
from here, because we're at the 1 hour mark. So
Okay.
put in a new tape.
All right.
So do you want to get up?
No, just I want to stretch. Have your notes?
And this was great. I'm glad you led to some of the things that weren't on the list of questions.
Ready?
Ready to go?
Roll it.
Okay. Larry, I want to go through a long list of names and ask if you can very quickly tell the people who will see this who these people were.
Very good.
Because we went over them very quickly earlier. John Salter.
John Salter was a teacher at Tougaloo College who was very political. He was involved in demonstrations in Jackson that were NAACP led. He worked very closely with Medgar Evers, and he worked very closely with Ed King.
And Medgar Evers.
Medgar Evers was the executive director of the NAACP. He was a person who went disguised to get information about the Emmett Till case. He was the political leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was very involved in in a lot of the political activity and civil rights involvement in the state.
And Tom Gaither.
Tom Gaither was a core member early in Mississippi and continues to be involved in the civil rights movement to this day.
Now, you mentioned when you were talking about the Freedom House address earlier that it was a place of reconciliation. What did you mean by that?
What I meant was that it was a place for people, regardless of where you stood in the movement, you were welcome there. Braden comes into the meeting, and he, as you know, Braden was a leftist.
Yeah.
And
Carl Braden.
Yeah. He has money, so he buys food, and because we didn't at that particular time we didn't have any money. Okay. I mean, so it was this kind of place. That's why I termed it that way.
Okay, John Doerr, we mentioned him a bit. Tell us a little bit more about John Doerr.
John Doerr is a hero of the civil rights movement, and he is best characterized as a man who was a relentless worker, who didn't stick to the script, who was responsible for moving the Department of Justice into civil rights vigorously.
He's an assistant attorney general.
He was the assistant attorney general to Robert Kennedy, who was the United States attorney. It was the U.S. attorney general. John Doerr was a Republican, very perceptive, very creative. I watched John Doerr represent the government in the case of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. And he said, he quoted Lincoln. He said, people will little note here what we say, but they will long note what we do. Mm-hmm. And of course, those people were convicted. So John Doerr, and I want to quote him, in 1967, he was at a conference at Ole Miss, and he was talking about the press and the civil rights movement. He said, look, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 2 cities, Macomb and the streets of Greenwood. Because what we were able to do is convince John Doerr and others that illiterates had the right to vote. And we convinced them, and we got that written into the Voting Rights Act. And Katzenbach, who was then testifying before the Judiciary Committee, said, I'm convinced of the constitutionality of all of this except the right of illiterates to vote. And we had argued, and we got the Congress to go along with us. And that's how no other group fought for the right of illiterates to vote except SNCC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford was a congressman from Michigan, and then later president of the United States. And when I talked to him, he was a member of the Congress. And he agreed to talk with us, and he told us because his bishop had asked him to. And when we talked to him, we talked about the congressional challenge, what was the basis of it, and he told us that he was going to do what the law requires.
And the Wednesday group, you mentioned a little bit about it, but tell us a little more about what the Wednesday group was.
Of course. The Wednesday group was organized by Dorothy Height. The Wednesday group were people brought in from across the country, from various states at various times, to come in and listen to the activists in Mississippi, find out what's going on, find out what they can do. Then they would leave and go back to their hometowns and talk to their senators, their congressmen, their bankers, their civic clubs, to put pressure on the Department of Justice to protect the voting rights activists.
Now, you also mentioned a couple of times the Ladner sisters, but flesh them out a little more.
Joyce and Dory Ladner come out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. They are related to Vernon Damer, who is a real civil rights hero. They are related to Medgar Evers. They're related to Victoria Gray, who is the National Committee woman of the Freedom Democratic Party, who is also very active in SCLC. Victoria Gray goes to SCLC and gives a great speech in Abernathy. Says, okay, Victoria, what do you want? She said, I want $7,000 for the Freedom Democratic Party, and they write the check. I mean, Victoria Gray was another religious fanatic. See, we had one in Fannie Lou Hamer, we had another in Victoria Gray, who becomes a political activist, who brings in her family. There were more people in the freedom schools in Hattiesburg than anywhere else in the country, in the state. The case of Theron Lynn is tried by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Hattiesburg.
He's the registrar in Forest County.
He's the registrar in Forest County. He takes the position that he's not. you have Julian, he turned down postgraduate degree people because they said you just didn't complete the test right. There's a great book written about him. It's called Count Them One by One. And it's written by one of the attorneys who operated in that state. It's a great, why is it a great book? Because it talks about the trying of Theron Lynn for contempt. It talks about the courage of the witnesses who participated in that. And it establishes a basis, as does the author say, and I totally agree, for really passing the Voting Rights Act, because it was very clear that the recalcitrance of this registrar, which was also analogous to 82 other registrars like him, because there's one in each county, once the court ruled against him, he simply refused to register people. Now, and this is the federal court. Now, John Doerr, when they're trying Theron Lynn, introduces me to Judge Brown, Tuttle, and Bell. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals followed, and there's a great book about this called Unsung Heroes by Jack Bass. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals follows and joins the Department of Justice in making sure that whatever they can do to back up the movement in Mississippi, they do it. We knew if we lost in Meridian or Jackson, all we had to do was wait until we get to New Orleans. Because in New Orleans, we win.
Griffin Bell voted.
One moment.
Okay.
We have somebody at the door, right?
All right.
They went away?
Oh, yeah. They went. Circuit, and how helpful it was back in those days.
These were all, the Fifth Circuit was made up of the most creative group of people who were committed to making the law useful for social political change. Ironically, these were all Eisenhower appointees. Each one of them filed challenge delegations in their states, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas. And they won those positions, which helped Eisenhower get the presidency. Eisenhower said to them, "What do y'all want?" They wanted to get on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They were on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And they established a legend of expanding the constitutional rights of everyone that came before them. Their position on the city of Jackson was that Jackson had an apartheid policy that was incomparable of anywhere else in the United States. That was the official position of the Fifth Circuit. They validated the removal cases filed by Arthur Kenoy, and they were later overturned by the Supreme Court and narrowed. They validated all Section 5 cases. John Doerr simply had to get to New Orleans, bring the case, and it was won. They overturned decision after decision by Judge Cox, who was an atrocious racist, who talked about black people registering to vote as a bunch of chimpanzees. Once we got to the Fifth Circuit, he was overturned.
One of them you mentioned, however, Griffin Bell, voted against me and kept me out of the Georgia legislature for almost 6 months.
Oh, Griffin Bell did some things worse than that.
Yeah.
Griffin Bell said to Andy Young, "Don't testify against Bork." And of course, as you know, Andy Young, to his credit, testified against Bork. No, I want to make it clear that of the judges on the Fifth Circuit, Bell was the least praiseworthy. But the Fifth Circuit was of the highest caliber of productivity for empowerment and for the revitalization of the 15th Amendment. It was amazing. These people treated what we were doing as their work. Theron Lynn, the only reason the Fifth Circuit didn't send Theron Lynn to jail was because they were again concerned about the political impact. He was 7'4", and he weighed 400 pounds. They didn't want him to die in jail. But they tried him for contempt, and they got what they wanted out of him. But again, once it became clear that you were faced with Theron Lynn type recalcitrance throughout the state of Mississippi, then you had to come up with a new mechanism. And a la comes the Voting Rights Act. And it was written by the Department of Justice.
Let me mention another name you mentioned that needs some explanation of who he is, Michael Thelwell.
Michael Thelwell is a brilliant man who comes out of NAAG at the students
He was a nonviolent action group.
out of Howard University.
Right.
He becomes involved with SNCC and he becomes attacked. And I asked him, we raised some money and I said, Michael, here's the check. Go to Washington, set up an office for the MFDP. Well, he set up what he does, he comes to Washington, he works with a couple of people, and he is able to follow the legislation in the Congress. He's able to deal with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and he's able to keep us informed on what he's doing. He writes a letter to Lyndon Johnson saying, we're astounded. All of the work that the Freedom Democratic Party did to get you elected in Mississippi, and none of our people have been invited to the inaugural. And Fannie Lou Hamer calls him and said, Mike, you know the man who's the postman? He said, no, Miss Howard. He said, well, he brings me this big envelope from the White House. And I'm invited, and then Mr. Turnbow calls, and he said, Michael, I want to let you know I got an invitation to the White House, and I want you to do something for me, Michael. Michael said, well, what do you want me to do, Mr. Turnbow? He said, I want you to find out what ball the governor of Mississippi is going to, because I want to dance with his wife. Hartman Turnbow, as you know, is a man who's accused of destroying his house, setting his house on fire. He has his wife and his daughters in this house, and he comes out shooting, and he kills a white man. But the state of Mississippi said, wait a minute now. We can't have a situation where we're charging someone who's defending his wife and his daughter from a burning house that's his. So what they decided, Julian, was that this man died of a heart attack. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, I know you may find this hard to believe. John Doerr and others asked me, would I be willing to go to the sheriff of LaFleur County, get him to sign a reciprocity bond to take to the sheriff of Holmes County and have Mr. Turnbow released to me. Now, Holmes County, 80% of the black people in Holmes County own their land. What was so strange about this was the Department of Justice understood that the only way to handle this was to go along with the state of Mississippi in the position that there was no murder. There was just a house burning. And then, of course, because the Department of Justice rigorously defends Mr. Turnbow, all charges are dropped on that. I did this myself. Now, I'll tell you what. There is no other recorded event where two sheriffs in the South combined to release by bond that they signed civil rights workers anywhere in the South. It never happened again.
Or one final name, you mentioned a couple of times, Robert Moses.
Robert Moses is a young man who came to Mississippi, a mathematician and a philosopher, who was able to get the most out of people regardless of what they thought of themselves. Robert Moses was a person who was totally committed to social change, who was able to work with anyone. He was able to be both an intellectual and a total humanist. He was a man who who believed that there was political potential in everyone, and who behaved that way, and who got a lot of people associated with him to behave that way. He was a totally courageous person, totally committed, and a thinker that has few people on his level. He was able to take problems and turn them into solutions. He was able to meld the difference between the rigidity of some of the SNCC folks with the free expression of total liberty to others. He firmly believed that he was ahead of the game on one other tenet. He firmly believed that those who do the work should make the decisions. He firmly believed that whenever anyone was arrested in SNCC, you either go to get them out of jail or you go to jail with them. And he never, here's a man who was beaten in McComb, and he files charges against the person who beat him. And the sheriff hurriedly held the trial, and we know how the trial went, Joey. And then they got him out of town. It's just unheard of. You mean you expect to be treated legally by a legal system that is designed not to treat people like you? He goes before a judge in Macomb, and the judge brags about how good we treat our darkies. And Moses writes, racists are never more exposed than when they brag. I mean, here's a man who is able to lay out the framework of what's going to happen in Mississippi. And then we couldn't do anything in Mississippi without the approval of the people of Mississippi. And that we got it. And we got it because we made it clear to them that we were never going to say to them, look, you need to go register to vote. Here's where the courthouse is, going on down there. We said to them, we're going, and we want you to come with us. And we never said to them, we're going to protect you. We never said to them, your name's not going to be in the newspaper. We never said to them, you can become an enemy of the state once you register to vote. And the complexity and the beauty of how Mississippi was organized was we got thousands of people to make that commitment. And I think it pivoted on two things. One, our style of operation. Two, the church. And three, the need for people to create a better way of life for their children. You see, we didn't have to tell people in Mississippi everything is political, because they understood that the Board of Supervisors determined whether or not there was a hospital in the ward, whether or not there were jobs, whether or not who was going to get paved. You could look at who was registered to vote on the street by what the houses that were paved. You wanted tax exemptions, so there was nothing that was non-political in Mississippi. And so we arrived at the early conclusion that the political avenue was the solution to a lot of our problems. And they were in the 60s, there was no Republican Party in the South. Nowhere to be found. It wasn't until 1964 that that the Democratic Party in Mississippi creates the unpledged electoral system, which allows us to become the presidential electors for Lyndon Johnson. But it also allows the infusion of the Republican Party. In 1964, the Republican Party in San Francisco kicks out black delegates, kicks them out. The Democratic Party is supporting the passage of the 64 Public Accommodations Act, and of course later on the 65 Voting Rights Act. So in 1960, you have the Democratic Party being approached to intervene in Martin Luther King's arrest. Lewis Martin and others they get the president to call Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King. Joe, the first black baseball player, Jackie Robinson, goes to Nixon and says, look, you can do this, you should do this. And he leaves crying because Nixon refuses to do it. Now we both know that telephone call and the blue leaflet that was passed out to every black church in America within 6 days is what made President Kennedy President Kennedy. Without the black vote.
I wish I could lay my hands on a copy of that leaflet.
I'm sure we can get it for you. And the guy who can get it for you is a guy named Hawk Davis at the University of Southern Florida. I have a copy of the trial transcript at Winona. I have a copy of every deposition taken by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party during the, and I got it all from him.
Now, when all is said and done, what would you like the world to know about you and the work you did in the freedom movement?
What I'd like the world to know is that I was a man who carried out his religious beliefs by his political activity. I never stepped away from a fight. I never asked any quarter. I never gave any. And I recognized the value of reading and of books. And I want to be remembered as someone who is committed to the perpetuation of the mantra of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because the only thing that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee can be compared with is the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was very effective, though short-lived. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee changed the very concept of democracy, changed the concept of citizenship, changed the open to everyone the vehicle of empowerment, because empowerment is something that's contagious. Once people are empowered, once an individual makes something happen that they made happen, they're a different person. They don't wait for somebody. The next day they say, well, what do I need to do today? That's the kind of people we need to have a good America.
Now, is there something we should have asked you that I didn't ask?
I can't think of anything except that we have an obligation to transfer our skills and our knowledge to other people. You're doing that, and I'm doing that.
But are we doing it as much as we should?
Well, no, but let us hope that we will understand the gravity of our situation. And in the next 2 years, we will spread by geometric progression those who are actively organizing. See, we don't need people to support us and agree with us and not register their families to vote, not register their churches to vote, not register their clubs to vote, and not really make organizing a social necessity. Mm-hmm. We should declare those who are not organizing for our empowerment and for the political change in the next 2 years as social pariahs. They're no longer functioning on our behalf. Isn't it amazing how we've, as a race, have moved from the concept of us to me?
Yes.
And we're the last group that can afford that. Mm. So, but now we're faced with an opposition that is so menacing to everything we value that now we must fight. Everything we've fought for will be beyond retrieving.
Well, on that happy note, let's thank you for doing this. We greatly appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.